Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 23. After several months of holding Palmyra under siege, Prince Dion had still not achieved his goal. This was, he claimed later, to have the Armenians come and fight him there, because his camps in this area were easy to supply from Judea and there was plentiful water. The Armenians in fact could not easily reach Palmyra because of how the lay of the Seleukid roads had been altered by the fighting around Edessa. The result was that the fastest way across the mouth of Aravia was to approach from the southeast, through the hardy desert roads that Dion did not imagine would ever be used by a substantial force. Indeed, he had not foreseen his cousin's success in the north, and nor did he alter his plan to utilize that success. Still, the siege came to an end when Bosporan reinforcements arrived and broke the hearts of the sentries atop the wall, leading to the city's swift capitulation. This reinforcing army consisted of several thousand infantry of Egyptian training and 400 steppe archers of Luthosis training. I would like to note that while Luthosis fashion horse troops were a key part of Bosporan military tradition, if such a newly established thing is really a tradition, almost all true forest folk warriors went west to fight with the king. Those sent to arm other generals were the ones bought through the thriving military industry of the steppe. To elaborate, the empire paid steppe tribes handsomely for cavalry trained in the quick and deadly style of the Luthosis, and the Luthosis had people happy to provide this training for a cut of the huge sums of precious metals being carted around the open plains. To export warriors was a surer way to build a tribe's economic position than to farm sheep or visit seasonal pastures, and so military business was becoming the cultural mesh of the Bosporan steppe, especially in the First Lands. This support army under Alcestis, Dion's Alexandrian strategos and would-be liaison with King Ptolemy, was sent back to Judea because it was very dangerous to have weapons not be brandished against the rural people regularly. Dion did not linger in Palmyra and sped away after securing terms of surrender that left the city freer and richer than they'd been as an Armenian tributary. He rolled along the Armenian border with Judea and Palestine, where there was a single main road serving all the garrisons he needed to reduce. Since news of Palmyra's fall went ahead of him with the camel-riding peddlers, these garrisons decided to abandon their positions or surrender at the first opportunity. This carried on for weeks, until the army reached Bostra. This city was actually closer to Hierosolyma than Palmyra, only the distance between them was impeded by a body of water which everyone called the Dead Sea. One might think this was a reference to Dion's own doing in the area, yet the name is older and of clear origin to any who saw the horrid water for themselves. It was always still and clogged with obscuring, albeit sometimes useful sediments that formed a film on the surface, as if the world itself was attempting to close a wound. Some say when the world was created, it was first created in an inverse fashion, after which it was turned inside out like a headcap, and that this Dead Sea was the axis around which that folding had occurred, leaving it not entirely transformed to a place of life. Was that why Yimo had made the region his personal domain, if the Judeans are believed? You'll as soon find out for yourself by gazing upon the waters and thinking of all possible histories that ever could be, than get the answer straight from a highly trained man of Hierosolyman theology. But the only point that concerns us now is that it hindered Dion's return home, and its salt and other minerals enriched the local city of Bostra to the point that its tall walls and many towers hindered Dion's advance. And hence the army halted near the city and built an extensive summer encampment to base the raids on the city surrounds. Dion had a most devious plan already in place for the capture of the city, but it was one that could not be enacted quickly. Just as well, for quick action in the summer heat of the Arabian frontier was possible by those for whom sand was as familiar a thing as dirt. People like this lived all around the city in nomadic droves and isolated villages, but there were no warriors among them to employ because the Seleukids had killed them all only 10 years prior. I am told the reason they did this was that some of the tribes wished to unite under a king and call themselves the Nabatios after a lost kingdom from the ancient times. An ill-fated proposal, although I am happy that people even in the harsh desert had some knowledge of their own history. Dion's scheme at Bostra began so slowly that hardly anyone could fathom what it was going to be. He blockaded the roads as per any siege, but also sent men constantly to inspect various things close to the Dead Sea. I will tell you later what he was doing, because it was a delightfully interesting approach to warfare. You might be worried though that a lengthy and overwrought scheme might expose him to danger. Well, to that I have two retorts. Firstly, that Dion wished danger come to him so that he could fight the Armenians decisively. Whether or not the balance of forces suited that attitude I am unsure, and it may well be that he was being foolish in his desires. And secondly, that the Seleucids remained paralysed by all that Aeneas had done to them. And with this, let me tell you something else the Witness of the King did at the same time as the siege of Bostra. He had mobilized his men from Hecatompilos and cautiously moved down the spice road towards the Seleukid lands. It was so cautious a move, in fact, that 3 months passed before he covered a distance that a good horse might traverse in mere days. Witness Aeneas of then and Strategos Aeneas of before were like different people, and the reason was that Aeneas was afflicted by the curses and vengeful visitations of the men he had slaughtered so mercilessly in his prior battles, most of all the great Ampelios, whose honour and adherence to Golden Age ways, little did he know, had earned him powers that I think are similar to those displayed by the paragons of old. He was undying in spirit, and his material existence was tied to that of Aeneas, such that the single body was sometimes overflowing with 2 personas. That is what people said of him, and I think if any of this was true, it was a mighty ailment deserving of urgent retirement. However, Aeneas did not like anything to be said, and all that I ever found in the library of Hecatompilos was practically allegory in how softly it treated the subject. All we have with certainty are the material results. Aeneas stalked his men across the land at great expense, and nothing much was coming of it. That was until he crept all the way to a rich Median city called Regi, named in Seleukid histories as Europos, which was the nickname Seleucus I had given it in the previous century. This was where Ampelios had set off from on his final campaign, and I think there might have been some force of him left in orchestrating his return. There are 2 primary accounts of the battle that took place here, one ordinary and one fantastical. Of course, I will provide you with both. To swiftly dispense the ordinary, there was an army stationed at Regi designed to prevent Aeneas accessing the rest of the Seleukid Empire, and they were so impatient at having to wait for this destined clash that they came very far out of the city to meet Aeneas on the road. In one of the regular dust storms that brushed through the land, which was the cause of it being barren because plants and good soils were rarely able to combat the burning solution of air and sediment, the Seleucids suddenly walked into Aeneas' army. Aeneas took his troops behind a close-by hill so that he was invisible again, and if you like you can call this hiding or cowardice. However, it was still the case that when the Seleucids marched right over the hill, they encountered a fierce battle formation that pressed up from the other side with eager shouts. The battle happened suddenly, and there was a meeting of a wide and ready Bosporan front with a drawn-out and half-bound elsewhere Seleukid patrol. As such, the Seleucids were vanquished in a manner that military strategists will understand easily, and there is little else to be said of how the chance and fortune fell on that day. Clearly it was the disposition of the Seleucids that doomed them. This is what the more detailed account of the battle seeks to expound upon, and it does so rather fantastically. In the most hidden scrolls of Hecatompilos, it reports that Aeneas, after concealing his column behind that hill, went up in person to negotiate with the enemy commander. He brought 4 priests carrying gifts of goodwill, and these are the witnesses to the scene that unfolded. When the Seleucids came close, Aeneas called to them in a loud and odd-sounding way, and at once the priests found that his accent of speech was altered. After he spoke for long enough that they were sure this was not some trick of the desert wind, they concluded he was speaking in a voice the Seleucids would find familiar. This was no mere stroke of diplomatic grace. Aeneas was appealing to the enemy by recounting tales of military feats that they would supposedly appreciate, pertaining to the security of the Seleukid Empire. Then he began professing his dual loyalties to the kings of his realm and the brave warriors that it harbored, during which Aeneas began to weep, ultimately kneeling and carrying on with a hand over his face. The Seleukids who were close enough were as confused as you must be. However, they recognized what was happening, and were aided in their conclusion by the partial concealment of Aeneas' face. They realized they were hearing the words of Ampelios. I say this not lightly, and before you think I am too fanciful, listen to what Aeneas said now, for he confirmed it with plain words when the Seleukids questioned him. "The cosmos is an evil place," Aeneas delivered. "In death I see what awaits us, and if we ally to the gods, they will make us toys of theirs in their lairs and otherworldly places not meant for humans. They make those places because they are jealous of the ones who made the world. It is those prophets our Bosporan enemies have already been enlightened by. Hear the words of I, who is not dead, because I am spirit still in service of those who recognized my skill. I am not dead at all, though death be fearful and worth avoiding for the likes of you. Still, there is much hope, because the Bosporans are teaching people how to live. I say go away and let these men carry on with their business, bearing no arms against those who would enrich us all. Go away and await a golden age, my brothers. Think nothing of any command that comes from one still enthralled by the meddling gods, and do anything one in possession of the creator Manos's power, the first of the dead Ymo's power, and the spirit of the world throughout time Taurus's power demands. That be I, friends. Make way, I say, swiftly and without pause for what you once knew. I will see you all again. I will." Having said all this, there was uproar among the Seleukids. Firstly, they were reacting to what they had just heard, debating the obvious retort that could be made against the trick it may yet be, and secondly, they had noticed that battle was beginning around the hill because the Bosporans were charging everywhere. Aeneas repeated his entreaties until he was pulled behind a phalanx by his salaried lifeguards, and the priests either drew their metal clubs or retreated to a safe distance. From here, the rumours about what had happened washed through the Seleukid troops. Once entangled with talk that the Bosporans were gaining ground swiftly, the army ended up in disarray. Their commandant fled, having known Ampelios personally, and thus been utterly convinced by the voice he heard, although he was killed the same day, so we don't have any better testimony than what is said of his reasoning by others. In the process of researching this story, I rightly asked those who supplied me with the scrolls if there was any truth to the tale, and inevitably I was told that there was. However, I'm still not able to confirm this, because the priests and scholars who emerged from Hekatompilos had a different view of the tripartite's powers to others. I speak of their insistence that paragon deities can form as easily outside of the Golden Age as within it, and hence that this whole affair with Ampelios' ghost was merely an example of what any man with good accord to Golden Age behaviour might achieve. A tempting idea, and yet I see so much good behaviour these days, and nothing that indicates immortality is so easily won. Nor should it be, I would judge, for a Golden Age to function properly. But I suppose I shall leave you to enjoy the debates on these matters elsewhere, if you wish. Whichever you believe, the story ends the same here. Aeneas took up residence in Regi, and billeted his army in the city for many years. Presently, the city was afflicted by plague and impoverished by the cutting of road traffic due to the war, making the whole area unproductive. Aeneas was upstanding enough to still attend to religious matters to calm the natives, while keeping to the true teachings of the Scions of Gold, so that the humanity of the people could be fed and nurtured. Some say Ampelios spoke to several people through Aeneas on future occasions, but I have never seen such things in writing. I said that all this work from Aeneas serviced the need to keep attention away from Dion's advances, and that was achieved well enough. Let us be like the Seleukids no longer then, and be informed on the details of Dion's scheme at Bostra. The principal concern of the scheme was that Dion had found out how the Armenians had marched an army down the Tigris, crossed the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, and were next crossing the desert to arrive at Bostra from the east. By adapting a plan he had once intended to use to defeat Bostra, he aimed to defeat these new arrivals, and it is my delight to explain what he did. Firstly, his operations at the Dead Sea had given him access to excessive inventories of salt. Secondly, he ordered his men to renovate the industries at the water's edge that performed the rare and frustrating business of extracting healthy water from the sea. This was a process only performed in this one place in the whole world, as far as I have heard. This is because the quality of the water extracted from this sea was very high and was demanded for in distant lands, and this sometimes overcame the hardship of acquiring it, because it was horridly slow and expensive to refine fresh water from salt water, as all alchemists will tell you, requiring extensive heating systems usually reserved for rich mansions, and instruments made of African glass. These had been in short supply since the trade routes to Alexandria were cut by war. Dion saw that it was worth his while to remedy this, for by improving conditions and instructing his men to act as workers, he was able to procure cartloads of good water that overshot his own needs greatly. With salt in one hand and water in the other, he was as unaffected by the Bosporan walls as a bird. His method of entry relied on allowing merchant caravans to still enter and leave the city, carrying food, but only after his men had dressed it all in salt, no matter what kind of food it was. Water, on the other hand, was prohibited strictly. Thus, the people of Bostra were not to starve, but the food they were being forced to eat was so horridly salty that they were either made ill through poisoning or furious thirst, heightening the danger of the siege by shattering all attempts at rationing their water. Some were clever about it and purged as much salt as they could, although this was difficult and not widely successful. The presence of increasingly vital water nearby was widely known, for Dion's produce was paraded before the walls of Bostra in the same cart-mounted cauldrons that once held the blood tithe of Tyre. The people and the merchants alike were naming outlandish prices to receive even small volumes of this water, indicating to Dion that the plan was about to succeed. A few weeks after this manipulation began, he allowed several nights to pass with no sign of the water being presented. With the aid of a company of fast camel riders, he confirmed the day on which the Armenian main force would arrive, and set out with a portion of his army to encamp in their path the eve before. His troops wore civilian clothing, concealed their weapons, and laboured greatly to move the huge water cauldrons to the new camp being established. The entire premise of this move was that the troops were to play as water merchants, seeking to exploit the siege, and they would simply claim to have purchased the water from Dion. This was not a simple or hard-to-unravel ruse. However, the circumstances the Bosporan people were in, those being of near delirium from lack of water, meant that only a passing attempt at securing their trust was needed to secure the next phase of the plan. Rumour of this merchant caravan tore through the city, and after the most desperate came out to investigate and returned with full jugs of what might as well have been ambrosia, the civilian body swarmed to Dion's new camp. Here, the robe-veiled soldiers did flying business, for any price was satisfactory to the Bosporans now. In this way, the sacking of the city took place quite voluntarily. The only care Dion needed to take was to not sell too much, for only the next morning would his bait truly be useful. Shortly before midday next, the army of Armenia approached. It was led by two storied warriors named Martik and Jerea, the so-called Sword and Shield of the King. They were hardy and statuesque men who had never once hesitated in single combat or in command of many thousands of men. Yet just the same as any rancid camp follower, they were bedazzled by the discovery of this open market of god-touched water appearing right in their path. Once incredulity was overcome, this did not take long because the desert had imbued these men with desperation also, the Armenian army went forward in barely tamed mobs to get to the prize before the locals had availed themselves of the lot. The crowds of civilians were pushed aside so that the army could reach the cauldrons. Tasters were used, and Martik and Jerea stood restlessly while waiting to see if anything obviously malicious was going on. Since all the civilians present had drunk from the water, this was an overly strict measure, yet I said these men were known for their prowess rather than intelligence. Dion greeted the generals, acting as the caravan's senior, and signed offers to drink for free. Dion was experienced with sign-talking to foreigners, and even used gestures to give orders to his own men frequently due to his lack of affinity for speech. He presented to them a chryselephantine flask of Judean design and offered it as a gift. This enamored the mountain generals even further. Once they had taken the water for themselves, an atmosphere of cheer gusted about the camp, and the Armenians sat around to discuss the situation with the civilians. Rumours abounded that the Bosporans had withdrawn to fetch more water because the merchants had paid them so handsomely for it, and it was easy to believe that an invader tinged with Greek decadence was so simple-minded. In this merry congress of refreshment, Jurea was the first to realise something was wrong. This came as Dion turned his robe aside to reveal a leaf-shaped dirk and ran it through Jurea's neck in the same motion. With a bestial howl used as a signal, the prince had his many disguised followers begin slaughtering Armenian men and smashing their weapons. The spilling of blood prompted the genuine civilians to disperse in horror, creating the backdrop of chaos that left only Dion and his conspirators with true knowledge of what was happening. Approximately 2,000 Armenians were killed in the rout, and endless amounts of military gear were stolen or abandoned. Martik was taken alive and forced to persuade some of his footmen to surrender. Others successfully escaped the scene and went to find the rearguard of the army out on the road. Many civilians went to the city, surely aware that some of Dion's men were still hidden among their own number. The gate guards were too sympathetic, or did not understand the danger, so everyone was let back inside, with the spies unaccounted for. This would pay dividends for the Bosporans in the days to come. For the present day, Dion mounted various captured stores and weapons on his carts, and prepared to return to his camp in the north. Regarding his captives, he laid out a gruesome scene that some have described as pious, although I think it is only the Alexandrian school of thought that is likely to agree with this. He lined up 300 prisoners before one of the cauldron wagons, and then dragged Martik to the cauldron's lip. With everyone's attention true on his blade, he slit Martik's throat so that his blood mixed with the dregs of water left in the vessel. The body was allowed to fall in with a ringing splash that erased any composure the soldiers had preserved up to now. Then Dion said, "Please tell me what you will give to make the world again." This line is repeated by some even today, albeit in calmer circumstances, to invoke the giving of one's productivity to the worldly cause of the Golden Age. In this case, though, it was interpreted by the translators to be a call for death. The soldiers were in tears because of their love of their general and because of the hopeless situation they had been thrown into by their own error. Some volunteered to come up to the wagon and be thrown into the cauldron also. Dion happily sliced the throat of each man and praised them with barked titles like "My King" and "Worthy of the Gods." After 15 men were killed in this way, no more were willing to come forward. At this, the ceremony was ceased, and Dion transported his prize back to camp. The remaining captives were likely astounded that they were not punished or tortured for their choice, but I believe they were actually being taught, in the most unmistakable way, that Dion had a sense of justice. There were many he wished death upon, however he had kindly offered his enemy the option of life or death, and been very diligent in seeing their choice honoured. This is an interesting quality of his, and one that he did not always display, rather being a behaviour he chose to show when it suited his mood. I cannot decide if this improves or detracts from his character, so I cannot recommend a course of action when it comes to studying him. What we can say with certainty is that the ploy was a resounding success. The Armenian army was brilliantly diminished. Bostra was filled with men eagerly awaiting a signal to throw open the gates, and the development of industry that the scheme nurtured was a clear example of the rejuvenation of the world, in line with the taming of a world that is ultimately a mere extension of humanity, and should not be left to work against us if we in turn should not work against it. Most will end the story here, however there is a blemish to the tale that casts a shadow on Dion's genius, such that many stop at the final milestone. Since it in reality is hardly as bad as Dion's acolytes believe, and is as real a part of history as anything I have described, allow me to complete your knowledge of the siege of Bostra. The objectionable event was a battle that took place a few days after the slaughter on the Eastern Road. I mentioned before that the Armenian rearguard had not fallen prey to the water merchant ruse, having marched one day behind the van and centre. Fleeing men alerted this detachment to the danger. Since retreat was impossible without resupplying, they had to carry on forwards all the same. This detachment was disproportionately rich in heavy knights and experienced soldiers, among whom strategy and battle sense was common enough that they detected the present weakness of Dion's position. By racing across the desert at an angle, they could approach Dion's original camp via a direct bearing. This method of passage brought them to the camp one day before Dion. They hoped to ransack it, seize provisions, and perhaps even turn the situation into an overall military victory. However, the camp was not unguarded. Dion had summoned Alcestis and some of the Egyptian soldiers to come and carry on the work at the camp in case more material was needed to conclude the scheme. Thus, there were at least 1,000 able-bodied men in and around the camp, and these men were rallied against the foreign banner seen to be approaching. As the two sides formed up for battle, Alcestis was unhappy to receive word of further danger. Bostra's people had decided upon the same course as their masters, and were thus coming to raid the camp for its water and riches before Dion returned. I do not think Dion predicted this, and overall his strategic vision was wide but narrow. To put it another way, he could come up with the most ingenious first step to a grand strategy, but would never imagine a second step. The Armenian nobles were at the front of their column, distinguished from those behind by their colourful silks and black helmets, hidden at first by the white coverings used for reflecting the sun during travel. Once they had armoured themselves and their horses for battle, they attacked, leaving their comrades behind. There was little Alcestis could do when this charge threatened to pass by his flank and imperil both the army and camp, but he was saved by the courage of a single company of steppe warriors, no more than 100 in number. They went out and sparred with the Armenian noblemen, even though the latter were much better armed. The Armenians were taken aback by this attack, and furthermore did not want to risk death in combat against opponents they considered unremarkable. How their considerations must have been changed by the way the steppe riders pursued and ensnared the heavier horsemen in close quarters fighting, or loosed arrows with such strength as to challenge the craftsmanship of the mountain mail. With the initial momentum of the fight seeming to indicate that the Bosporans were advancing, the Armenian troops were not sure where to go, or what their leaders, embroiled in the skirmish, had planned. This must have led them to scatter, because they did not stand and fight when Alcestis came forwards with all of his spearbearers. This in turn heightened the panic of the nobility, and the battle was quit with all the haste they could muster. The Bosporans could not pursue because the mob of city militia, some even trained soldiers, were being herded towards the camp. Alcestis went to cut off their path, and found they were not willing to fight either. Hence, in the withdrawal back to the city, at least 4,000 were slaughtered. Others have said 20,000, although I don't know if reports of Bostra's prosperity in the years to follow can be reconciled with such a steep loss of life. Alcestis had not the liberty to exploit the day further, leaving the city alone for the time being. Once Dion returned and reconstituted his full army, he went to the city and found its gates opening before him. There was no sack. To the contrary, Dion brought looted things and fresh water to placate the local people. He levied a work gang and had the bodies of the recently slain moved to burial places outside each gate, where he ordered that ceremonial wooden gates be erected. The meaning of this was that the life power of those killed would heal any who walked through the gates from then on. I have never heard of such a thing being a proper method of magic, but on the other hand, the Alexandria school was known to have discovered new things about magic rather than relying on what was known from the original Golden Age. So I think this was a good thing to try at the very least. It was also a kindness of Dion towards the people. He had learned the value of peace after Hierosolyma, and indeed Alcestis had to return there constantly to judge treason cases brought before the city temple. Dion took his men and secured many places in the surrounds of Bostra, including the important caravan rests on the road the Armenians had fled back down towards the Seleukid Empire. With this, the frontier was peaceful, if not secure. At this time, King Pyricedes gave both Dion and Darius permission to seek peace, and let the Seleukid front lie fallow until the need of war came about again. Such an arrangement was sought. However, King Hoiros was too wounded by all that had come to pass to ever let his people rest. The original cause of the war was long forgotten, and the Bosporans had no cause at all, but that a state of war couldn't be ignored. There was no ancient wisdom to procure, no great injustice to right, and no reason why the people should be denied their peace and wealth to please the wants of kings. Indeed, it was not very different to the kind of war that ended the Golden Age, so bitterly far from the hopes that a new Golden Age might be nigh. There is no escape from this trap. Not one idea that any scholar who lives in my time has advanced successfully. What was the right thing to do then? The king, Pyrrhosides, wished to conquer the Himanians so that they would be spared a fouler fate at the hands of the evil kings of Rome. Dorius wished to conquer because he saw that it was what the people wanted from him too, let alone the expectations placed upon him echoing such calls. Dion wished to conquer because it was proof of his worth, for the enriching effect it had on those looking to him for patronage, and for the security one gains in crushing rivals. Whatever you think of these reasons, conquest and war was their course. And as students of the true method by which the present state of the world came to be, it shall be our course too.